In this lesson, we'll take a look at lighting special effects. I've got the same scene open as I've had since we started exploring lighting. I've reduced the lights down to 1. This is the default, so we just have one light, one camera. It's the distant light so far. We haven't set anything up yet. We've got one object and one room, which we can throw shadows onto. So the first thing we're going to do is explore volumetric lighting. So what I want to do is change the light type to a spotlight. This will enable me to go ahead and choose a projection image, which I will do in just a second. And also, this enables me to go ahead and set up a cone angle and basically decide how wide this area is going to be that gets projected, and exactly, the rotation that's going to happen when it comes to setting up the lighting that's hitting our character and the shadows. So we can move this and rotate it to our heart's content, but basically just trying to set something up that's going to affect our character. So what I've done is I've positioned this light slightly behind Stu and to the side. Then I've rotated it downward so it's casting something on the floor. So this is my frame. I'll render this out. It's basically what I'm looking at. I think what I'll do actually is just rotate Stu a little bit as well. And let's get the camera set up so that I can see this better. The effect that we're creating. Alright, we'll go with that. Okay, so for this light, like I said, we set it up to a spotlight. We're going to choose a projection image. What I did was I downloaded a image from the web. This could be any image that you want to project. I found a stained glass window. This is what it looks like. Let me just open this up real quick as a preview. There it is in all its glory. And we'll go ahead and choose the projection image. I've gone ahead and loaded up this image. We just go to load image and choose that. There it is, and you can see it's projecting the stained glass through the spotlight, which in and of itself looks fairly nice. But let's go ahead and explore volumetric lighting. So if I click on volumetric lighting, I am going to activate the volumetric lighting option. So I need to click on this button, volumetric light options, or volumetric options for light. And what this panel does is it gives me control over the type of volumetric. So what is volumetric lighting? Volumetric lighting is the creation of particles that can be viewed by the light. So it's kind of like smoke. Think of it as like dust particles, but it has a very interesting, aesthetically pleasing effect. And I'll explore that with you now. First off, you got to choose the quality. If you have time for a still image render, best will give you the best quality. If you're doing an animation, you're probably going to have to keep it low, just as a warning. As we go through this, I'll adjust some of these parameters and give you a sense of how this works. But first and foremost, the cone base and the height. You want to go ahead and give yourself a real large height. Now, again, a VPR mode is going to allow me to see the results of my fog, hopefully somewhat in real time, but I'll put this at 0 for now. To get the actual particles visible, let's crank up the luminosity to 100. We'll start there. And then we're going to start playing with the height, which should be visible here in the form of this cone. You see how it's kind of stretching out towards my object. In this case, Stu, and they keep going until I've got a real visible element that I can work with. So let's just try like 100. You can see now I'm really seeing the fog. This is what the light rays look like that are being broken up by my image. So I'm starting to get these rays of light through the dust. Now this is where I start to play with, once I've got the height set up, the base will be at 0 because that's where the beginning of this fog begins, where it starts in the light. So this is my range. I want to turn on opacity cast shadows because what this does is it allows my object's shadows to interact with the particles. The next thing I'm going to do is play with the luminosity and the opacity settings until I get the look that I'm going for. So at 0% opacity and full luminosity, we get a fairly washed out smoky effect. And if we go even further with luminosity, we can get this really bright. So you really have to decide what works for you. I'm going to show you the controls, and you can decide for yourself what you think is looks the best. I think it's a little too much for me, especially given all the color involved. But again, for some people, this might be perfect. If you increase the opacity setting, let's try like 100. Let it work its magic, and you'll start to see some subtle changes in the way that the fog is represented. And typically I find that if you go, the closer in number value these two numbers get, the more diminished the fog becomes. And I go ahead and just play with these numbers given the position of the light, the intensity of the light, and the scene to sort of figure out exactly what works for me. But unfortunately, with best quality turned on, it takes forever for this to render. So if I go lower in quality, it's a little faster, but you know, it's really up to you as to how patient you are. But this is the illusion, this is the effect that we have. Now, if you go subtle, which I think is more to my liking, you go for a real low luminosity setting. Now, not so low that it's invisible, but something like this, I think to me is just more to my liking. It's there, it's present, but it's not so dramatic that it's just overtakes the whole scene. And remember that the intensity of the light plays a role as well. If you crank up the intensity, this will totally change the look. So I cranked this up to 600 to keep it real bright, which kind of like now makes it look like sunlight coming through a church maybe. And if I go down further in luminosity now, since I've got more intensity, I can really start to get a more subtle look. And there you have it. Not subtle on the floor, but definitely subtle on the streaks of light. Let's see what that does. We'll hit the render frame. This takes a while to render, so I'll let it do its thing. But as this goes, boy, this one is really, it wants to take 9 to 11 minutes to render one frame. So you can see this would not be suitable for animation. You can imagine trying to wait this long for 30 frames. But for quality purposes, it will give you the best look. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and put you through that, but you can experiment on your own and just see like how the quality setting affects the render time. Just out of curiosity, I'll just hit render frame and just see how much faster that would be. Now it's capable of doing it in 34 seconds, so that's a little more manageable. Of course, it's a lot noisier, and in the best possible environment, I would want to go much higher than that. In terms of quality, but you know, for a demo, I think this is fine. Again, it's also going to play a role as to whether or not you're doing a background render or a still image or an actual animation. An animation is really going to be difficult unless you have a long time to wait for your animation. But the results are quite engaging. I really like this smoky effect. I think it looks beautiful. Again, that's a more subtle look. You can go increase the luminosity for something more vibrant. This may take, well, render time's quite similar actually, because I'm still using that low quality, but again, if you want it less noisy, increase your quality level and try it at home on your own, where you've got all the time in the world. But as you can see, this just makes the particles a lot more visible, a lot brighter. As I've gone up in luminosity, I've increased the rate, the brightness of how these particles are interacting with the light, which is already very bright at 600%. And so you can just imagine this cleaner and sharper. That's what you get, but a lot of streaks of light coming through with that. That's just one example, of course. You could try any number of different projection images through your spotlight, but that's volumetric lighting in a nutshell. It's nothing to be afraid of, but the render times are something to be feared, that is for sure. All right, I'm going to turn off my volumetric lighting, and let's now create a lens flare. So I'm going to go ahead and take this light, and I'm going to turn it into a point light. It doesn't have to be a point light. You can use any light source you would like. I'm just trying to change things up a little bit. But a lens flare is capable of making a flare, I believe, out of any light source. At least I don't think I've ever come across a situation where the light didn't work as a lens flare. So what is a lens flare? Well, if you think about making a light visible, you notice that if I put the light in the scene, so in other words, if I put it in the line of fire of the camera, whoops, which it's currently not. Let me try and position this better. It's hard. Perspective view always lies, so it's hard to know exactly when it's visible. All right, we're almost there. And let's decrease this. Still too much. That's better. All right, so now let's go take this camera view to texture shaded solid. There's my light. See that light there? What if I want that to actually render? You notice that by VPR mode, it doesn't render. The effects of the light render, the shadows, the light on the floor, the light on Stu, all renders, but the light itself does not. So what if you wanted like a practical light, like a lamp or the headlight of a car? Well, that's where lens flares come into play. Now it's visible. There's my light in its most basic, simple level. Of course, with the options, we have a lot of custom features available, and I don't think I'll even be able to hit on all of these, but I'll give you an overview. So first of all, the intensity of the flare. How intense do you want it? Something real bright and noticeable, or something a little more subtle? All right, if you're using fog effects, you can fade it. You saw this with volumetrics. You may have noticed that option as well, but we're not using fog. Fade with distance, so if it's further away or closer up, you can fade that. Fade if it's behind an object, so if it goes behind Stu, it will not be visible. That may sound strange, but I guess I should quickly demo this. If it goes behind Stu, see that there? It's no longer visible, but if I turn this off, it goes right through Stu. So you should know this option exists if you're planning on doing animation with these, because it'll look really fake if you're not. And you can do sort of a half thing, like where it's kind of just peeking around Stu's body like that. So yeah, pretty self-explanatory, I hope. Next up, this is where things get a little fancy. You have the ability to adjust the rings of your flare. I guess I shouldn't skip over dissolve. You can dissolve the flare, so it's becoming less and less visible. All right, so central glow, that is the basic foundation of it. So if I take that away, you notice there's a simple little ring there. You may not see that, or well, it's there. I don't know if you can see that well on my video. I'm trying to see if I can make it larger or smaller, but it's not very bright. Let me... Well, let me continue and then you'll start to see what I'm talking about. So there's the glow. Here's the ring. I don't know if you can see that being turned on or off. We just adjusted the size, but again, I'm not sure how well that's showing up. That's why I'm concerned. But let's go a little further. We'll come back to that. First of all, you can change the color of the ring. Maybe if I do that, it'll stand out better. If I make it blue, not so much. Too bad there's no intensity for that ring, but okay. Well, anamorphic distortion just refers to a bending of the flare. This is kind of a thing. Anamorphic lenses I'm not going to get into because it's very technical, but Basically, they're commonly used in Hollywood, so it's a way that you can sort of make the flare match the distortion you would get in an anamorphic distortion, but well, it's not really noteworthy at this point. So streaks, you can add filters so that you can have more streaks. Here's kind of like a Star of Bethlehem kind of streak, and there you've got a little bit more points. You got 6 points instead of 4. You can go crazy. It looks more like a photon torpedo at this point. You can rotate these. You can spin them around. What else? Lens reflections. These are these little aberrations that you get in zoom lenses with lens flares, and so that's what this does. It lets you change the nature of those lens flares if you're looking to emulate that sort of distortion. I don't play too much with these, but it's kind of like the Photoshop filter for lens flares, if you notice that. Or if you've seen a lot of Hollywood movies in the 1970s, they really loved lens flares back then. It was kind of a thing. They started to explore these in movies like Easy Rider, for example. But there is some customizability of these lens reflections. Okay, streaks, rings. This is really kind of the core of a lens flare. This is basically what most people are creating with these. I can make the ring big now. You can probably see it better. Anything with an E key next to it is animatable over time. Now, I haven't mentioned envelopes at this point in any of the lessons, but you may have noticed these E keys. So if you would like to adjust these over time, you can, and here's how it works. So for example, if I wanted to make the ring grow from point A to point B, I click on the E key, and then I have the graph editor, where I can use the Add Keyframe tool to plot values to make it grow or shrink based upon time. So here, this is the timeline. Once again, if you've seen the graph editor before, 0 to 120 below. This is the numbers, so 100% and down to negative values. So if I close this now, you'll see what I'm talking about as I play this. You start to see, I don't know how fast this can render. VPR mode doesn't handle this very well. But let me just try and show you. So now at 20, it's small, and then it grows bigger. So can you kind of see that animation, hopefully? But yes, you can animate the size of that ring over time alongside any other of these attributes like dissolve or intensity. And if you want to get rid of the envelope, you shift click it to eliminate it. Well, I apologize if I'm not being very scientific with my observations of lens flare. To me, it's just a way to make your light visible. There's some basic controls if you want to have a ring or not have a ring, a center to the glow. If you just want like a headlight effect without the ring, for example, a headlight of a car. These are the basic parameters that are involved with lens flares. Okay, so once again, these are located on the basic tab, volumetric lighting and lens flares. And those are the basic special effects that Lightwave has to offer. They will slow down your render time, especially volumetric lighting. But I just wanted you to be aware of these so you have a full understanding of some of the advanced lighting features that Lightwave can showcase. Now, on the super advanced level, there's also the ability to implement global illumination options like radiosity and caustics. Now, I'm not going to get into these because they really are designed for still images, not for animation. And volumetrics are kind of pushing the limits as it is, but these really push the limits in the sense of the render time. Well, our computers just cannot handle the intensity. But just so you understand, what radiosity does is it calculates reflected light. So if you think about the world you live in, when you look at a wall, there's not necessarily a light pointed at the wall, but you can still see it, right? Because light bounces off other objects. You might have a light pointed at the floor, it bounces off the floor, and then cast light onto the wall. Well, radiosity enables this to happen. So when I turn this on, you can see that, yes, even without moving my lights, Stu has this natural fill on his body. And that fill is really light wave interpolating the light from this light source, which, could have a flare or not have a flare, but it is interpolating that point light, bouncing off the floor and back onto Stu. So it creates for a much more realistic look, but it is very expensive on the render time. So when it comes to rendering animations, I prefer people don't try and light with this, because you can do the same thing with or similar fill with a standard fill light, with a point light or other lights that are just going to render faster when it comes to animation. So, but if you were doing still images, this is great. If you're just doing modeling and you want to render those out, then these are excellent to use for that. Caustics refers to bending of light. So it's not going to show up in a file like this, but say, for example, you had light passing through a transparent object like a magnifying glass, then caustics would be calculated. The bending of light and the way that you get those interesting light patterns when it travels through glass or transparent objects can be emulated by enabling caustics. But again, it's very render intensive, so it's not great for animation purposes. But it's there for you to explore if you have the time or the interest. When it comes to the render tab, you have the ability to turn on certain features like ray trace shadows. This is kind of a global switch. So if you have a lot of lights and you want to disable the shadows globally, you can turn this on or off. But typically we leave this on because shadows are a big part of what we do, and most computers can handle shadows at this point, so it's something that we typically leave on. You can also adjust the global intensity of all your flares here, since we just talked about flares. And they can also be turned off here as well globally. So these are kind of like master switches to cut things on or off. Volumetric lights, same thing. So if you're doing a quick down and dirty render and you had like 6 volumetric lights, you don't want to go back to all 6 lights and turn them all off individually. You could just come here and disable them, and same with lens flares. So that's really what this is all about. And I think that's a good place to leave it for this look at basic advanced features when it comes to lighting. And hopefully you can explore some of these a little bit deeper on your own time.